Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Joseph Orosco, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University. I'm also the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that imagine a future free of exploitation, domination, oppression, war, and empire. One of our projects is this one, Conversations with Organizers and Scholars, in which we have discussions to talk about pressing issues and themes of the day. And I'm really excited and think that the urgency of this conversation is very needed at this moment. My guest today is Dr. Joe Lowndes, who is a professor of political science at the University of Oregon in Eugene, Oregon. And he is a scholar of far-right populism in the United States. He is the author, most recently, of the book Producers, Parasites, and Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity, 2019 from University of Minnesota Press. He writes widely for different outlets and most recently had a very influential article in the Washington Post, which we'll try to make accessible to you all. But I have invited him to talk with us today about the surge of far right-wing violence in Oregon and in the United States in general, leading up to the November 2020 elections and what we might be able to expect of violence surrounding this election season. So thanks, Joe, for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, Joseph. I love this website, and I think this kind of thing is crucial in this moment to have radical perspectives and forms of reflection that help us, think through, reflect, and think of ways forward.
Yeah, no, I appreciate all of your work in particular, but what I want to get at first is just a little bit about your own scholarship. Is why study right-wing populism and threats of fascism to U.S. democracy? What brought you to this work in your career?
That's a good question. Sometimes I joke that I'm kind of like the garbage man of political science. I'm the one who's got to take care of all the stuff that no one else wants to talk about. So that's it partly. I began my, I was involved in political collectives, anti-racist collectives, ecological collectives for years prior to, during college and before graduate school. And we, in those projects, we wrote together on these issues of how to confront a growing right, how to confront a U.S. politics where, the right was dominant. I grew up in the Reagan era. And so for me, those were always the questions in the back of my head or in the forefront. How was the right so successful? How was it able to do things it did? How was it able to get such broad buy-in, let's say, from so much of the electorate? And of course, some of that has to do with racial politics. A lot of it has to do with that. But it's got a lot to do with a lot of things. And the other thing is that I grew up in the South. And, I think that Southern politics, particularly in the mid-20th century, began to play a larger role in national politics and the subsequent rise of the right and the conservative wing of the Republican Party. So that's what I ended up writing my dissertation on, which then became my first book, partly to actually take seriously the ideas and organizing strategies of particular people and organizations and intellectuals on the right and coming out of the South. So that kind of sets up a kind of an historical story about the relationship of race and the right and the production of a certain kind of political identity, kind of a modern middle America white populist identity. So when I was done with that book, I swore off writing about conservatism or anything further right after that. I was, I was done with it, and I had other projects I wanted to take on. But then, the star of the right had not yet begun to fade. In fact, it kept rising through the early 2000s, and so I found myself drawn back into studying and researching these things again. But the book you nicely mentioned, actually, I'm a co-author of it with Daniel Martinez Hosang. And then we actually tried to look at some of the curious and complicated politics of the right and far right in the post-civil rights era, which is to say that a lot of this stuff is still driven by racist and white supremacist imperatives, but in ways that scramble normal racial codes, that you might see forms of multiculturalism on the far right, or kind of a celebration of a certain kind of civil rights narrative, among conservatives. And so that's partly what we were up to there, as well as looking at maybe emergent forms of racialization or the uses of racial discourses against white folks in a way they had not been before. So, in that book, we looked at the ways in which public sector unions became the new welfare queens after the Great Recession, or during the Great Recession, or the way that conservatives now talk about the white poor in language that was once reserved for Black people or Indigenous people or Latino people, Latinx people. So partly, we were trying to figure out new codes and new forms of racial formation. And so that's partly what that drove our ethnographic research, as well as our other kinds of discourse analysis and cultural analysis in that book.
Fascinating, yeah. And part of your work then has led you to studying an outgrowth of a lot of these vectors coming together, which is far-right violence in the United States, particularly after 2017. In an article that you wrote most recently, and I think that this was distributed widely in the kind of left web network, you wrote that you've seen that at this point in history that a US President, Donald Trump, has never outly courted violent right-wing support in the way that Donald Trump has. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about what you think those vectors are that have come together that have led to the ability of President Trump to be able to court white nationalism and so forth so openly. Why has this come to a head at this point in history now?
The right and far right, or the Republican Party and the right and far right, always have a relationship. They're always in kind of a dynamic tension or forms of cooperation, support, or opposition. And so they really they need to be talked about together always. There's not a legitimate sphere of politics and then something on the far right which exists apart from that. If the story really is the story that begins in, I think, in the early 1960s, I was going to say the mid 20th century, but when Barry Goldwater runs for president in 1964 as a Republican nominee, he is an arch conservative. He's really more conservative than any presidential candidate has been in the Republican Party since Hoover. The New Deal kind of discredited conservatism in American politics in some ways, but conservatism needed something else to kind of help bolster it, help move it forward. There were elements of conservatism and the far right which fed it. The John Birch Society, which was a conspiratorial organization, anti-communist organization founded in the 1950s. And a lot of Birch supporters became Goldwater supporters. But that kind of conservatism really was soured most Americans. And so, the other place to look was in Southern racial politics and Southern fights against the New Deal and Southern fights against a liberalism that white Southerners began to see as racial liberalism. And so, you see kind of a courting. Goldwater kind of courts, white Southerners in a way where he's connected to people who had been in the Dixiecrat revolt, and so therefore the Council of Conservative Citizens and that kind of thing. But he has to do it kind of slightly at arm's length, and the result is that he wins in 1964 his home state of Arizona, and then 5 states in the Deep South that had been solidly Democratic since Reconstruction in the late 19th century. But then, it starts to creep in at the edges again. George Wallace, Governor Wallace from segregationist governor from Alabama, runs in 1968. And he runs as an independent candidate. He had run as a Democrat in 1964 in some primaries. He runs as an independent. He runs a national campaign. He has to get on the ballot in all 50 states. Because he's so far to the right, he has to look for whoever's willing to work with him on the ground. In the South, he gets Klan support and Citizens Council support. But outside of that, he's got to find new allies. And, by 68, there had been cycles of summer violence, riots and uprisings in, Detroit and Newark, and obviously famously Watts in 1965. And out of this came new forms of white right-wing vigilantism, which were both far right and white supremacists, usually. Wallace uses those, people from the Minutemen in California, uses, groups in New Jersey, like kind of far right proto-fascist groups in New Jersey. He uses, other American Nazi Party members in Wisconsin. And these different groups help kind of put Wallace on the ballot and bring in, a lot of people, Democrats and Republicans, probably more Democrats, into the Wallace campaign. Richard Nixon kind of swoops up that energy, which is not to say that Wallace didn't do well. Wallace got 10% of the votes, 10 million votes that year. But a lot of that energy kind of goes into the Nixon campaign. But then the right is never really satisfied with Nixon. They see him as a welfare liberal. They see him as having opened up diplomatic relations with China as two things that really compromise him. So these kind of like far right populists, some who were former Wallaceites in the 1970s, looking around for a third party formation. They look to Wallace's old party organization, the American Independent Party, and a lot of that's populated with white supremacists and white nationalists, different kinds. They try to get Reagan. They try to draft Reagan. They're unable to. They try to draft Wallace. They're unable to. Reagan goes with the Republicans. Wallace goes with the Democrats. But it's this kind of weird, strange mix of former Republicans and far right elements that really help create what's called the New Right, which then goes on to draft Reagan for the Republican ticket in 1980, moving Reagan, who himself is a kind of a very right-wing figure, into the mainstream of national politics. Reagan uses right-wing demonology on the campaign trail and also in office. But once he's there, you have a Republican establishment which keeps these far-right elements at arm's length. Reagan's FBI and Justice Department goes after the Aryan nations, goes after the order, goes after these far-right groups there to suppress them. The Republican Center doesn't need them. After 8 years of Reagan and 4 years of George H.W. Bush, the populist right gets restive again. They feel like the Republicans have sold out too much to the mainstream. David Duke runs for first in a state house election, then for governor in 91, then runs in the 1992 Republican primaries. Republicans want to keep him at arm's length for obvious reasons, even though George H.W. Bush had used the Willie Horton ad, a racist ad around linking crime and blackness and masculinity. They still wanted to keep that at arm's length. But Pat Buchanan, Nixon's old speechwriter, syndicated columnist, jumps into the race, uses anti-Semitic, racist, xenophobic language, brings in this question of nativism and immigration, steals all of David Duke's supporters and some of his organizers, and runs a quite effective campaign against George H.W. Bush in 92. And then he runs again against Bob Dole in 96, winning the New Hampshire primary, and really bringing in a lot of these far-right elements, but more than that, far-right ideas around xenophobia, around racial nationalism, into some respectable language. And so you've got this kind of bridging of the far-right, racist right, and what are called paleo-conservatives, around various journals. They're kind of a small group, and they don't really have a mass social base by any stretch. Then there's a period of Republican consolidation and stasis. There's a lot of militia activity during the Clinton years. Bush too, when he runs, doesn't want anything to do with that. He like his father also is pro-amnesty and pro-open borders. After 8 years of Bush, the far right emerges again, first in the form of the Tea Party movement, then in birtherism, and then in various kind of nationalist and particularly anti-immigrant politics, drawing on the old David Duke, Pat Buchanan model. this, build the wall stuff really partly goes right back to David Duke. And then that kind of moves the far right kind of to the center of politics when it's taken up by a candidate in 2016, Donald Trump, who comes out out of the gate with, as we all know, pungent, racist, xenophobic, violent language. And so Trump kind of courts the elements that had been built up around xenophobia, particularly in years previous. That's how he gets Stephen Miller on board, Chris Kobach. There's a whole list of people in Department of Homeland Security, elsewhere. Obviously, Steve Bannon, coming from Breitbart, who continually flirts with white nationalism. So that's how it kind of like gets brought into to the Senate Republican Party through this figure of Donald Trump. There's a bunch of other things. It's not a causal story. Trump is this television figure who has extraordinary instincts around what will sell and what won't sell. Remember, he's 10 years on a show called The Apprentice, where they're focus grouping every week, trying to figure out what people like and don't like. In that sense, he's like Reagan in terms of really knowing how to communicate to his base. And so that kind of brings us up to this moment. There's other questions that come up about the emergence of the alt-right, and then the decline of the alt-right, and the emergence of the patriot movement, and these other things which we can get into as well. But I feel like I'm monologuing at length here.
No, that's part of this is that's curious to me is, did Donald Trump have connections to this far right before he became president? You said that he was able to court folks like Miller and get Breitbart on board. Did he have previous connections to these, as far as you know?
He has his own. If there's one thing that's been consistent about Trump, and there's not that much that is really consistent, it's kind of like his racial animus, really. And some of this goes back with him to the Central Park Five in New York. Some of it goes back to his father's own history in the real estate business in Queens, and his dad's own Klan affiliation. Maybe some of it goes back to Germany, who knows? But he's not an active participant in that stuff. He ran actually as a candidate for the Reform Party in 2000 against actually Pat Buchanan for that nomination, and paints Buchanan as the far right lunatic, and himself is kind of like a billionaire liberal in some sense. So it's really, some of the story has to do with Ann Coulter getting hold of his ear around immigration politics in 2016, and when he began parroting the birther conspiracy theories about Obama being born, in Kenya, not having a real birth certificate. That stuff kind of brought him into a network of kind of partly Tea Party people, partly xenophobes, partly racists, who then kind of like helped push him in a direction which he's kind of suited by his own personality to take up. But he's not, he's not like a card-carrying member of any of these organizations prior to this.
Okay. So part of what I want to get at is to understand the current moment that we're in. This summer has seen a wide variety of political violence, beginning, of course, right, with the state violence that led to the uprisings in Minnesota, with the killings of George Floyd, and then others around that same time. So we've seen these kinds of insurrections, these rebellions against this kind of state violence. But what I'm really interested in talking with you about is this question of the reactionary violence by far right groups. And so in places like Albuquerque, New Mexico, we saw a shooting of protesters at a protest against trying to bring down one of the statues of a Spanish conquistador. And then, of course, the violence that happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin, more recently. The summer has been one that's been punctuated by this kind of right-wing violence in different places. So part of the question that I'd like to ask about this particular moment is it different than what we've seen before? Because the US has a long history of right-wing violent groups terrorizing people of color or working class movements. So is this moment in the kind of right-wing violence that we're seeing, is it different than what we saw, for instance, in the 1920s or even in the 1960s? And if it is different, in what way is it different?
There's connective tissue, and then there are clear differences. the fascist movements of the 1920s, the German-American Bund, the Silver Shirts, Klan groups like the Black Legion, these were also anti-immigrant groups and deeply nativist groups, also anti-Black, authoritarian, violence-prone. And so there are, in some ways, some similarities there. One difference is that these groups at that time, and there were a lot of them, and partly they were tied to countries of origin, the same way the left was, connections to Germany, connections to Italy, etc. But they were up against, they weren't incorporated into the state in the way that you see it today. Say what you want about, Wilson or other presidents that era. I think that they, who themselves were, for the most part, white supremacists, but like most white Americans. But they weren't, these were not organizational arms of the state, or there weren't, although you could make arguments that in the 1920s, the state is using its own similar kind of apparatus through Hoover's, first the Palmer raids and, Hoover's FBI. But one of the things is that those movements were up against organized forces of the left. There was the Communist Party was very large in the 1920s. Anarchist movements and organizations, socialist organizations, labor organizations proliferated, in urban areas. You probably were likely to see more right-wing or reactionary movements in some rural areas, but even there, you have kind of like some of the legacies of populism. Some which go right, some which go left, but they weren't dominant forces. They were consequential in certain ways. They were not. The 1960s has regional forms of severe violence, and some of it is state violence, like the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission. It's essentially a state secret police organized out of the governor's office in Jackson, but it's tied to Klan and Citizens Council organizations around the state. They're doing the work of violence and repression on behalf of the state of Mississippi. So you saw it at the subnational level, but you didn't really see it necessarily at the federal state being involved. Although you could argue that the FBI is involved in some of these things, or is infiltrating Klan groups and far-right groups in ways that they're certainly not, sometimes provoking and certainly not stopping real murders, like in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1979. So those, but when you get to the role of the actual presidency linked to this stuff, it's in its current current iteration, it's different, I think, and it's not that these groups are necessarily organizationally connected to the presidency, but there's so much overlap, right? There's the way that Steve Bannon, comes over from Breitbart. He's continually talking, using the language and talking about, about white nationalism in certain ways. People like Stephen Miller, who have, some connections to people like Richard Spencer and others. But they're not connected exactly. As a matter of fact, I think Charlottesville is this moment for the alt-right to come out of the closet, the kind of like vicious, racist, and it's important to say misogynist, the extraordinary incel movement. These are mostly loners, mostly online, not really connected to government, often doing their violence and murders, not organizationally, but inspired by what's happening on 4chan or 8chan or other internet message boards. That kind of is denounced by, it's not denounced by Trump, but it is denounced by Bannon, and other people in the administration are like, this is not for us. And as a matter of fact, those groups actually are kind of pushed back on to the internet and out of the streets after 2017, after Charlottesville. What has happened now, though, is this kind of extraordinary network of patriot organizations. These are far-right militia groups who actually were not necessarily connected to Trumpism in 2016, but are much more so now. And they have grown in number and size and influence over the last couple of years, really coming into their own this summer, first around coronavirus stuff where they are connected to, they see themselves defending the language and imperatives of senior Republican leaders in the Senate and the president himself, as well as state Republican leaders around reopening the economy. So you guys, people with AR-15 saying they want to, someone said it's a strange thing to say a revolutionary movement, armed revolutionary movement, fighting to get back to work as opposed to fighting their bosses. But that's, that we just saw, we've all seen images of that in the Michigan State Capitol and here in the Oregon State Capitol and other places. And these were kind of like a, hodgepodge of groups that were kind of finding their way to each other. If I was here at one in Salem, Oregon, May 2nd, and there was a mixture of like Proud Boys and 3%ers and QAnon people and anti-vaxxers and regular Republican families who look like they're out for a picnic, all kind of blending together, but in the process kind of like shaping a new political identity, in so doing. So that's, and not against, if you look at the white supremacist movement in the 1980s, say, 70s and 80s, who comes out of, Vietnam War vets. Kathleen Belew's book on this is really terrific, War at Home. These people are anti-government, anti-state, revolutionary. That's a different movement. What we have now is these armed vigilante militias who see themselves working on behalf of the Trump administration, working on behalf of Trump, working with the Republican right, because those lines have been blurred. They certainly here in Oregon have been blurred. The Multnomah County GOP chair uses militia people for private security, or we've seen it at protests in Portland where you've got Oath Keepers working with Portland Police Bureau and DHS cops against anti-racist protesters. So these lines get kind of blurred, I think, now. And then, at the level, going to the very top, you've got Trump defending Kyle Rittenhouse, who killed the 17-year-old shooter in Kenosha, as well as other Republican leaders also defending Rittenhouse, not just as a victim, but as a hero. Tucker Carlson refers to him as someone who stands up and does what no one else is willing to do.
Right.
So that's very different. Somebody who, even a couple of years ago, would have probably been seen as, most sympathetically, a disturbed teenager, right? Or less sympathetically, a racist killer, or a psych, or he killed white people, but there because he's there to stop Black Lives Matter. Now is a different kind of person. So that's part of it. And then you see Trump involves himself personally in the killing of a Patriot Prayer member in Portland. The self-named Trump caravan comes into Portland to confront Black Lives Matter and anti-fascist protesters. There's some kind of confrontation, and Michael Reinhold allegedly kills Aaron Danielson. A few days later, Danielson is killed by federal agents outside Olympia, Washington, under conditions that are contested by eyewitnesses. But when Danielson is killed, Trump tweets condolences to Danielson's family. This guy's part of a far-right violent street gang. It's a very strange thing that the president would intervene to talk about this person in these ways, but there he is talking about Patriot Prayer member. Patriot Prayer is an extraordinary violent street group. Everybody, the top leadership all has criminal records, and they all are there to physically attack their opponents. Then Trump tweets again saying we have to get this cold-blooded killer. And then once Danielson is killed, Trump calls it necessary retribution. Whose revenge is being sated here? It's a bunch of interesting questions are raised by Trump saying this is retribution by U.S. Marshals working on behalf of the Trump administration against somebody who is seen to be aligned with anti-fascist protesters. So that's all new. Presidents wouldn't need to connect themselves to these kinds of. Reagan's popularity or Reagan's base or Reagan's power was not connected to any relationship to Aryan nations of the order. Neither Bush president, and going back, you just don't see those kinds of things. Even George Wallace's campaigns, when they're working with the Minutemen and when they're working with the Klan, are still like, we got to keep these people at arm's length and deny any public relationship with them. You can see all that in Wallace's own papers. So in that way, we have the line between the Republican Party and the far right, again, historically in a push and pull, historically all based on racialization, racial politics, now really becomes not just a perforated line. There appears to be no line.
So part of the story, of course, is that it seems what you're saying is that what's new is that the federal state is giving cover legitimacy to these kinds of groups in ways that are unprecedented. Right. I'm curious about a couple of things you said. So one of them is that you're observing new political identities on the right forming that include sort of more mainstream conservatives, along with anti-government folks in general, but along with these far-right militias. And I want to talk a little bit about the internal organization of some of these groups on the far-right violent fringe, right? So you mentioned Charlottesville in 2017. This was sort of the appearance of a lot of these groups for many Americans in the first place in a really sort of public setting. And lots of different groups rose up at this time, but have since fallen apart, fragmented because of internal kinds of conflicts with one another, personality conflicts. Some of them have gone to prison, right? Richard Spencer himself went underground for a while, so to speak, and has come out and saying that he thinks that the alt-right is dead. So there's been this kind of fragmentation amongst the parties that were at Charlottesville. So part of the question I'd like to know is that we're seeing different militia groups pop up in different places, Michigan, Wisconsin, Portland, Oregon. How organized is the violent far right? Is there any sort of internal coordination between all of these different groups? Or is it still, as you were saying before, a kind of regional upcropping of different groups that then are given cover by the federal government? What's your sense of the internal organization of the violent far right?
You know, I think that this particular right that we're talking about, the patriot movement, which that we see on the streets now, that menace Black Lives Matter protests or you know, set up checkpoints in Oregon during the wildfires. This all is. I put this question to Jason Wilson, who is a Guardian reporter who covers the far right. He's based in Portland, probably the best beat reporter on the right.
Yeah, some great work that he does. Yeah.
Yeah, and deep investigation and very thorough. And Jason's position is that this is really all social media driven, and from his own investigations, that this stuff just, and I think, you know, this is confirmed by other sources as well, is that these things that just fly around Facebook pages or you know, on Twitter feeds, other kinds of kind of popular online media. You don't have to go down like a road to some kind of ghoulish, you know, like neo-Nazi kind of like, you know, whatever kind of internet pages to do this. It's all kind of like through like Facebook, and people will put out, form organizations and put out calls, and they just kind of people just kind of put up a call to a thing, saying why they're doing it, saying why people ought to be involved. Other people will post. It's easy to send the stuff around, to copy and paste it or just share it. And these things go around and around. And so you have a lot of people who actually already share kind of a worldview, an interpretive framework, which then makes it easier to kind of like act. If someone says, you know, if you're already prone to believe that Antifa is you know, funded by George Soros or other globalist entities, and is armed to the teeth and has a clear terrorist agenda, or if you think Black Lives Matter is you know, it wants to put in place you know, one Patriot member in Salem told me recently that they wanted to install a Marxist matriarchy, and I told him the problem with matriarchy and Marxism, they'll probably go together because one's hierarchical and one's, you know, supposedly communal. But he was hell-bent on letting me know that it was really getting men out of the house was the key to Black Lives Matter. Looting and getting men out of the house. For him, that was why he brought his AR-15 to Salem that day. But so, you know, people who have these, you know, they're already predisposed to have a worldview that these are enemies of the people, enemies of the republic, enemies of democracy, enemies of decency. People who are hell-bent on chaos, then it doesn't take much to get you out. And if you're a gun owner, and gun sales this summer have gone through the roof, right? I mean, there's there's 300 million guns out on the street right now. Very few of them registered, and tons of people have them, and tons more people have gotten them. So I think under those conditions, you've got people, particularly under conditions of pandemic, right? People are they've got time on their hands, they've got time to ruminate, they're consuming a steady diet of conspiracy theory. And so here you've got like QAnon giving you the basis of conspiracy theory. And then you've got people saying that Antifa is going to show up on the streets here today. And then the people will come because they want to be active participants in guarding the republic. They want to be active heroes. They want to be people who are defending the American republic. They don't need like a deep, ideology of like, I say like the difference between Kyle Rittenhouse and Dylan Roof, for instance. Dylan Roof, kills 9 black people in a church in Charleston. You see him with his like Rhodesian flag insignia and all this other like deep white racist, white nationalist stuff. That guy's like deep down a rabbit hole of like pure eugenics and white supremacy. And with a patriot movement, you don't need that. It's just the idea that you are protecting traditional values of Americanism, not necessarily racist. The 3%ers, if you go to their website, first thing they say on their about page at their website is, we are not white supremacists, we are not racist, we are multicultural. The same with the Proud Boys, same with the Oath Keepers. They will all really want to tell you that they are not white supremacists, they're not white nationalists, they're not racist at all. They are just deeply patriotic and American. And that provides a much thinner ideological ground and much more widely acceptable for people who feel like they want to kind of affectively join in gun culture, affectively join in heroically through kind of old recycled frontier narratives or whatever else to defend the republic. And so that's what we're up against. And that's really where it's dangerous. The 3%ers are not, the Oath Keepers are more, Oath Keepers are a more organized group. 3%ers are more kind of like, like people sew those patches on their clothes or put a bumper sticker on their car that says a 3%er symbol or whatever. They're not necessarily part of a local collective or a group or anything else. And this provides weaknesses, but around social violence, it provides strengths.
Well, there's some connection, right, or at least amongst of members with law enforcement and former military in 3%ers, right? A lot that we've seen, and may explain some of the connections between some of the patriot groups and Portland police that we've seen in the past, say, 3 or 4 years, right?
That's true. The Oath Keepers are self-consciously made up of former veterans and law enforcement officers, or current veterans or current people serving the military and law enforcement officers. The other group, which we should mention here, is the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, which is kind of a group that grows out of the old Posse Comitatus movement, which was a racist, rural, anti-government movement that in its current iteration are law enforcement officers who vow that they will defend the Constitution around a particular interpretation of the Second Amendment, and that they will not enforce laws that abridge the Second Amendment or freedoms as they understand them. And, it's not just a right-wing kook, well, it is in some ways, but, the sheriff of Roseburg for a number of, when the Umpqua shooting happened in Roseburg, you had this shooter who himself, mixed race young man who was imbibing a lot of white supremacist literature. And then the person overseeing the whole law enforcement arm of it is a sheriff who's a member of the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. So you've got like different elements of the far right all involved in the story in different ways. The sheriff of Grant County and like 6 other sheriffs across Oregon are members of this group. So you have actually a very organizational set of ties that are actually, these are state forces. These are forces of the state that are tied to far-right ideologies. So that definitely is the case.
Well, so that raises another question. You mentioned a little bit about how a lot of this upsurge has been a result of the crisis of the pandemic and giving people time to go down these rabbit holes on social media, so to speak. Here in Oregon, of course, right, in the past month, right, we've seen the wildfire crises, which both you and I have experienced quite directly with the the hazardous smoke conditions. Many people, of course, many towns were completely decimated. Many people lost their homes. And what we saw here in some of these rural communities were militia groups organizing checkpoints, roadblocks, patrolling to quote unquote protect private property from looters. I saw on social media different reporters being stopped by some of these militia and being questioned. And so there seems to be the presence of these kinds of groups. And then we also saw a video was leaked of one of the Clackamas sheriffs talking to residents in the area, and in some senses inciting the idea of the need for some kind of militia presence, sort of saying that they would kind of look the other way if there were these militia groups roadblocking. There was this kind of sense of that this kind of connection between law enforcement and these militias. So the question is that we saw these groups rise up. Does this indicate that there's a broader kind of coalition amongst different kinds of far-right groups here in Oregon? Is this an indication of some kind of network that we should worry about, particularly here in Oregon? And is it mirrored in other places in the United States?
Well, I think we have it in spades here in Oregon for a number of reasons. You know, it's for, but which we can get into. The kind of the immediate prehistory of this whole checkpoints situation with the wildfires is that, you know, earlier in the summer, there were, you know, Portland has been on national news, right, for the nightly protests against, you know, first against Portland Police Bureau and the mayor's office, then against federal agents who were in town, then back with the Portland Police Bureau. And these are nightly protests that have gone on for, you know, for months. These are replayed in the homes of people across rural Oregon who feel like they share nothing with the protesters in Portland. And this is something that's, you know, animating their, or agitating them, let's say. Earlier in the summer, there was a couple of incidents where word spread really quickly that there were going to be busloads of Antifa people showing up. In Klamath Falls was one place, and Coquille was another place. And, you know, in a couple of those instances, you had either a National Guardsman helping to spread those rumors or local law enforcement helping to spread those rumors. But again, they'd go out over Facebook and other social media. And, you know, Klamath Falls, suddenly one night, there's a small Black Lives Matter protest on one corner, and then 100 armed militia people across the street who are trigger happy and ready for this busload of you know, Antifa people to come in. And of course they don't, because there's no busload of Antifa people coming to Klamath Falls to loot. But the way that conspiracy theories work, of course, is that no outside empirical information matters. In fact, the absence of it helps the conspiracy even more. So the response afterwards is, well, what happened to all the Antifa people who were supposed to show up? They said, well, we scared them off because we showed up in such large numbers. So that, you know, this was already happening in a way that no one was able to say, this is absolutely ludicrous and dangerous that this is happening. No one's, you know, law enforcement is, you know, in some places encouraging, in other places kind of shaking their heads, but, you know, they're not, at the end of the day, vigilante movements help police forces. They don't hinder them. That's something we have to keep in mind for all of us, I think. But so by the time we get to the wildfires, people are already primed to have you know, a series of beliefs about what's going on. And Antifa is like this giant multi-headed hydra, which can do all kinds of things, which can suddenly dispatch itself into Malala or deeper into you know, areas of the Willamette Valley on fire with gas cans and matches. You know, there were arsonists certainly that over the last few weeks. None of them are connected to political organizations, of course, but it was enough that people really, and really a lot of people. So what we know of is a few people who showed up at checkpoints with guns, but really like thousands of people got and shared those Facebook posts saying that Antifa was coming or had come already to these rural areas to burn and loot. People, you know, people in my neighborhood in Eugene, people all over the place. And so these, you know, and so it only takes, you got, you know, a couple thousand of those messages going around, you get maybe a couple dozen people who want to, take out their rifles and show up at a checkpoint. And then you have, you've got something actually happening here. And I think that's, that explains, I think it's less, I think there are organizational connections now between the Oregon GOP and some of this far right stuff. And I think the candidacies that we're seeing, Alex Carlatos here in this district, for instance, who was one of the heroes of stopping the Muslim train attack, as I like to think of it, is now running for Congress here against Pete DeFazio.
We have a QAnon candidate, I think, running for Senate, correct?
Ray Perkins running against Merkley as a QAnon candidate. So here the organizational ties actually are the organization's happening is not on the far right fringes, but actually in the Republican Party itself. And then you've got this kind of less organized, kind of rumor mill kind of thing spreading outside. I think I don't, there's much more to the story than I know, I think.
Well, this sort of leads me to the big question that I want to ask, and I think that many people are concerned about. Tensions arising, of course, around the presidential election, which is just about 40 or so days out from where we're talking about here in our conversation now. This has been heated, of course, a lot because of the passing away of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Right? People are feeling that the stakes are very high in this election. And President Trump, of course, has fanned some of the flame about this too by talking about how he deserves a third term, how there's all these small remarks that he makes about how he wants to change the Constitution to allow him to be able to run again. So there's all this discussion that makes the security of the elections very precarious. So one thing that people have been wondering about is what might be the violence associated around Election Day. So in your opinion, should we be worried about right-wing violence around the presidential election in November? And what sort of scenarios do you think are possible or probable given what we've seen this summer so far?
In terms of right-wing violence around the election, I definitely wouldn't rule it out, that's for sure. There's a number of people there who have kind of tried to map out the possibilities for violence. And actually what's kind of extraordinary is that there's broad agreement among mainstream liberals and even mainstream conservatives that we might see, a lot of violence, not just on Election Day, but in the weeks following that. And part of it is that, Trump has been giving people a steady diet of belief in election fraud, and that if he doesn't win, it's because of election fraud. And if the polls don't show him the winner, that's been stolen. You can imagine the tweets that will go out, if he doesn't win. Millions of illegals voting, dead people voting, etc. So he has said that already. He has also said that repeatedly that he has support from groups like Bikers for Trump. So he's kind of, and this Jay Danielson stuff is just another example. He continually courts far-right vigilante groups, really, who will be happy to kind of ride to his aid after the election. So this is not to say that any of this will pan out, because who knows? You can't really, you just don't know. But just to think of it a couple ways. One is to look back at the 2000 election. And if you think of what happened there, which there was contested ballots in Florida and in New Mexico and elsewhere. And it was a very, very close race, both in terms of the popular vote, in terms of the electoral college vote, between Bush and Gore. And it came out down to some close voting and vote counting in precincts in a couple of states. The Republican National Committee organized people immediately, dispatched them out to the places where ballots are being counted. You remember this? And so in, say, Dade County and Seminole County, Florida, they show up at these precincts, screaming their heads off, creating havoc. They, at the time they were called the Brooks Brothers riots. So you have these kind of the chaos of Republicans demanding that vote counters stop counting votes, deliver the election to Bush. And part of that gives cover to the Supreme Court, and that's to take the extraordinary move of intervening to decide that no more ballots can be counted and that George W. Bush is the president. The Supreme Court installs Bush as president. Now, there's another set of questions about who actually got the who won. Well, we know that Gore would have won the popular vote, but who would have actually won the electoral college vote, and we don't know that. But it certainly was stopped, interrupted beforehand. So we actually have a recent history of something that looks a lot like a coup or installment, right? Of a president.
Well, one thing to just to say about that, right, too, what was interesting was that at the time, candidate Gore told Democratic forces to stand down and not to mirror the Republican strategy of putting protesters at the counting site. So there was a call out not to engage in any kind of street force to influence the elections.
Yes, yes, and I think that I think Democratic organizations are now, this time around, calling for people to come out in large numbers at the streets. But to hold off on that for 1 second, I think, but that is true. So Gore thought, being a gentleman there was gonna do the job, and of course selling out all of his voters in so doing. Imagine how much more polarized politics are today. How many more armed vigilante people who are identified with the Republican Party are in the streets, who are ready to do violence, have talked continually about civil war, are ready to go to the mat for this, are ready to shoot. And with a president who has already attempted to negate, even remember after the 2016 election, there was a lot of violence. Even though Trump won, you still had Trump supporters, setting bombs, setting fires, all kinds of things that happened that kind of like happened for a few months afterwards, even though he won. So you can imagine scenarios. Now there's many different scenarios. I think the Election Integrity Project outlines 4 possible scenarios, and for them, the one that has Biden winning by a landslide is the one with the least likely for there to be any violence. I don't think that report accounts for right-wing vigilante violence almost at all, and so I think that that's one deficit in that very thorough report. But the other thing is, you can imagine like this coming down to very few votes in certain states, right? It could be very close, and these things being fought out, in election districts in Michigan and in Ohio and in Florida and Wisconsin, in Minnesota. Maybe or maybe not, but if that happens, then you'll have a situation where you might have Republicans who all voted in person, right? And then Democrats who are more likely to vote by mail. And so by the time you get to the end of the day, it looks like Republicans have won it. You can imagine Republican secretaries of state or Trump himself saying, stop counting. And then you can imagine from the top, you can imagine Trump dispatching U.S. Marshals or DHS agents to these places where voting is going on. It's one thing to have regular people shouting at these poor vote counters in Seminole County, Florida, retirees essentially, or most people who make up these, who are the volunteers doing these vote counting. So then they actually have armed vigilantes and federal agents on the scene. So you could, then it becomes a much more complicated scenario on the ground, and the possibilities of violence. Democrats have, when social movements, progressive social movements, have said for people to come out in the streets, and defend a Biden victory if it happens. They're not calling for armed violence, and you're not likely to see the armed. You'll see some reports that are saying there's going to be violence on the left and right. There's just nothing on the left that has. There's not remotely the firepower, not remotely the glorification of masculine violence or shooting on the left side. So you're not gonna. You're just not. It's not going to be the same. It's really right-wing violence that we're talking about is going to be the real threat. And maybe it won't be a threat, but there's. There's been a greater threat of this kind of violence than there has been since 1860. Let's put it that way.
Well, so you sort of hinted at something about this. There is a lot of sense, I think, in some of this social media conspiracy theory bubble that goes out that there's an equivalent sort of set of violent firepower available to all different groups, and that somehow the left is going to be really significantly violent in this kind of way, given the kinds of images that are coming out of places like Portland and Minnesota or something like that. But you've written, and this was an article that was distributed through Common Dreams, you wrote that it seems as though that Black Lives Matter is one of the only social movements out there on the streets that's challenging this kind of right-wing force. And so part of this, I have a couple of questions to think about this is, why do you think that the left broadly has been unprepared for this kind of right-wing surge? And what do progressive radical forces need to do now to prepare for the elections and the violence that might erupt given the elections as you've described them? What can the left do, broadly speaking, to prepare for what might be coming in the next month or and a half?
The first question is a much easier one to answer than the second question, I have to say. But part of it I think is that, if I could back up, I'm sorry, you asked me what time it was, and I'm about to tell you how to make a watch. But part of the story is that we have now exited an age which was really the majority of the 20th century, or at least the second half of the 20th century, early into the when the Cold War kind of kept together an American consensus, an idea that whatever separated the parties, they both, Cold War liberals and conservatives, agreed that there was a Soviet enemy and that there was an economic and political enemy, communism. And this kind of held together. And also in the post-World War II, anti-Nazism gives us kind of like also something that means that forces on the far right and forces on the far left are kind of like kept off the table in terms of the United States kind of, center-right political, push and pull between Democrats and Republicans. After when the Soviet Union falls, the Cold War's over, and it opens up all kinds of new possibilities of political identifications. And the right realizes this quicker than the left. Pat Buchanan is one of the people who really realizes it first, and begins to kind of push the U.S. right out further and further right, because there's different enemies and different possibilities going on. The progressives, so I think that the right actually began to feel less constrained by institutional norms, less constrained by kind of like consensual agreements. The left, I think, or progressive, let's say liberals, are more loyal to institutional power and to American institutions and to ideas of fairness based in this constitutional system, which has never been fair, but whatever. But the idea there, I think, is that the left has been kind of playing a catch up and reaction, and always responding and reacting, because it's even all the language around Trump, this far right leader emerges, this proto-fascist president comes to power. And the way the progressives liberals are likely to talk about him is as a populist, right? And not even, with no qualifier, not even right-wing populist, authoritarian populist, just populist. And that, people like Yasha Monk or Jan Werner Muller or these other kind of, or Timothy Snyder, these kind of like liberal scholars and intellectuals, historians, political scientists, all talk about what we need to be doing is defending institutional norms, defending American institutions from the bulwark of the right. So this puts us in a position where Trump is unconstrained. He's not held back by any of this stuff. The left, meanwhile, is going behind him, trying to shore up and talk about decency and talk about civility and talk about the Constitution and talk about these things that we need to, a civil order that needs to be respected and upheld. But that's not where we are, obviously, right? I mean, the Ruth Bader Ginsburg thing shows us very exactly, like, the Republicans aren't playing that game. They're not interested in that. They're interested in raw power and have for quite some time. And this puts us on different ground. And I think that's why the right has moved, has more flexibility and mobility in terms of what it is doing and what it can do and what it will do right now than what you have on the left. The old constraints are gone, but the left has, only began to find its footing. It does through Occupy, partly. It does really through Black Lives Matter. It does through the Sanders campaign in a different way. Begins to articulate kind of broader hegemonic things. But the left has to work through questions of settler colonialism and white supremacy and patriarchy in a way that the right is unconcerned with. And so the other side of that, of course, is that this has always been the case in the United States. Black-led movements have always been on the front lines of emancipation struggles for everyone. And it's always been true, and it's true again now, that what we see, that the groups that are in some ways most marginalized, most abandoned, most clear on relations of power are the ones who have been actively in the streets, pushing for new alternatives. And not, I mean, the thing that's actually extraordinary about this uprising is that it came from below, it came from the streets, it came from spontaneous action. In Minneapolis, when they burned down the 3rd precinct, this was mass popular action. And this didn't come from think tanks, and it didn't come from foundations, and it didn't come from scholars and intellectuals, and it didn't come from spokespeople. It came from spontaneous movement from below by people who had enough. And the extraordinary thing is it spread like wildfire across the country, giving us the largest mass movement in U.S. history, the largest mass movement in U.S. history, multiracial, Black-led, multiracial, which actually is an extraordinary combination, which is something that is our greatest source of strength right now, is that we really have, it's no longer just the white left in with all of its problems. Now we're beginning to have a multiracial movement that is challenging not just in narrow economistic terms, power and rule, but the rule by white supremacy, the rule of racial capitalism. And so this gives us something very different now in the streets. And it's not also connected to the Democratic Party. That's the other thing that's important about it. Because I'm a political scientist who lives in Oregon, you get these steady stream of media calls saying, well, don't you think these Portland protests are going to make it easier for Donald Trump? Don't these protesters see that they are making things easier for Donald Trump? I say, I can't answer the question. Watch what the protesters are doing. The protesters are out of the street night after night. They're not there to decide whether or not Donald Trump is president. They're there to take on the racist brutality and murderous history of the Portland Police Bureau. That's what they're there to do. This is a municipal struggle, just like municipal struggles in Rochester, in Louisville, in Kenosha, everywhere else, that are really about something deeper and more profound than a Democratic Party victory, right? And so this is something that, and these are therefore the forces that the far right knows that this is a dangerous force. That's why they show up with guns at Black Lives Matter rallies, because they know that what they actually have, with all their conspiracy theories, aside, what they get is that there is a dawning of a kind of radicality there, which puts, there's something here also about changing demographics in the United States, which is connected to this. And demographics aren't destiny, and race is a social construct, and who counts as white today is different than who's going to count as white tomorrow, or different than who counted as white yesterday. But nevertheless, there is something about this set of changes which has driven a certain kind of both panicked white imaginary, but also set the terms for new grounds for a universalistic anti-racist struggle.
Well, so that raises that second question. The emphasis there that I asked was, what is to be done? You said partly that part of the problem on the left, one, is not understanding, I guess, or wanting to take a certain kind of power, at least in sort of the liberal left, with this kind of sense of like, well, when they go low, we go high. That doesn't work anymore, right? But then the question is that amongst the left, there's more of an awareness of the need to work through things like patriarchy, settler colonialism, and racism, and that this can often lead to divisions. I think Arun Gupta, right, a colleague of ours, right, has written about the struggle in Portland and said that this has been really difficult to try to create that multiracial coalition that you're talking about, because working through those issues in a mass movement is very, very complicated. And this has led to tensions between different sectors of the groups in Portland that has made the group not as effective as it could be. So part of the
social forces, yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, what I want to end with you is thinking about that enormous task of trying to work through those kinds of issues. What can we start to do and where can we start to work? You were mentioning that this seems to be mostly a municipal kind of effort at the moment. Is there a sense that we ought to try to focus on our local struggles and see how this percolates into networks and connections with other organizations? How can the left respond to all of the multiplicity of different kinds of challenges that confront it in thinking about building an alternative democracy in North America?
Well, first I want to say, luckily we have 3 large anarchist jurisdictions in the U.S. now, which helps. There are 3 big cities. I would say, I think that the answer is, as it always is organization, right, and struggle, right, and involving ourselves politically, throwing ourselves into politics as if they matter. I mean, there are, within any movement, you confront, racism, patriarchy, homophobia, transphobia. All these things are going to be, they're going to be in there, going to be cross-cutting. There's all kinds of things. But you don't work those out in essays. You don't work them out in Facebook fights or Twitter fights. You've got to work them out in collectives, in groups, in action, in acting together. Right? These are processes that have to be built through action, and they're not because they're not abstractions. And people also, as Hannah Arendt said, people become different through action. People become themselves. People become political actors in a different way once they're in the streets and with their comrades and with their friends. And so partly I think the challenge is to particularly I think the pandemic has provided both challenges and opportunities here. One challenge of being together socially is very hard, but also many people who are not frontlines workers are given more time to consider joining organizations. When I say joining, I don't mean it's like go join Democratic Socialists of America or whatever, although that's fine. But having collectives of 3, 4, 5 people deciding together, like, what do we think is the most important thing? Who needs help? What kind of alliances are we, like, who's out there that's doing the kind of thing that we think ought to be done? And how can we help them? What are our principles? What do we stand for? How are we going to self-reflect on these things? Where are we going to, how are we going to hold ourselves and each other accountable while doing this work? And these are the kind of questions that, that drive it forward, but it also has to be joyful and participatory. The kind of like the door left, kind of like Jeremiatic, finger wagging stuff is not going to build a movement. It has to be, and that's what we see in Portland. It's a great example. Pop mob. It's celebratory. It's fun. It's dancing, and as well as being militant. And we have to find those things because we face an increasingly dismal future. So we're going to have to find joy in each other, and as we help make each other into a movement. And I think actually I would say, I just said things were dismal, which they are. But I think we actually are at a moment of opportunity here that we have not had, that we have to really mark and really let sink in. You're talking to comrades in Minneapolis while that was even now in George Floyd Park, there are forms of self-organization which are extraordinary that are going on there. To go to the Portland protests, and I'm sure you've been up there too, extraordinary to see actually liberals, probably from suburbs of Multnomah, in bicycle helmets and ventilators, sometimes body armor, out in the streets confronting federal agents. It's extraordinary, extraordinary. These are people who have become something different by showing up in the streets, not by reading a tract necessarily, although that's always good too, but by showing up and putting bodies on the line. This really actually can change perspective in a way. And we're gonna need much more of that. I think that, the forces of reaction and the dangers of fascism are paramount. And I would not want to downplay that, because I think that we are in that moment. But the forces of class struggle and Black liberation and anti-racism and indigenous struggle, all these things are there's new openings, there's new possibilities and openings that I think we have to think about strategically and take advantage of. The other thing about the left in this election is that Biden is not the candidate of the left, obviously. Biden is not a candidate of Black Lives Matter. Biden is not any of those things, but here I'm probably more of a popular front person. I see kind of like broad lines being drawn, and we got to decide which side of that line that we're going to be on, and under what conditions. Struggle is going to be hard, and things are going to be bad. Even if Biden wins and enters the White House next year, we are still stuck with 40% of the country that is deeply supporting far right politics. That's like that puts us in we are still in a very perilous situation when you have neoliberal rule and then far right forces ready to step in. So it's not like things are cool once that happens, but if we don't get that, then we're really in trouble, I think.
No, I think that's a good place to end. An awareness of the dangers that we confront and the possibilities of change and new identities that we can form through action together. That's a place to begin. Professor Lowndes, I want to thank you very much for your time and the conversation here and the insight that you've given us. Appreciate it very, very much.
Thanks so much. This is really a pleasure to talk to you about all this. And it's nice to see you. Well, not in person, but face to face in some way.
As much as we can be in person.
Yes.
And thank you all for coming to spend some time with us. If you have any sort of thoughts, please leave us some comments down below. You can reach the Anarres Project at social media on Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook. You can also find us at our website at anarresproject.org. We welcome your perspectives and your comments. So hopefully we will be able to speak with you again, Joe, and get some more insight and see where things are in the future. But thanks so much for your time.
Thanks so much. I just want to say finally, I think Ursula Le Guin would be proud of this project.
Oh, thanks. Well, you know, she did know a little bit about us before she passed away. My co-director, Tony Vogt, was a friend and collaborator with Ursula. So
oh, terrific.
she knew about this project and she didn't necessarily give it its blessing, but she was honored that we would continue doing the kind of political work in her name. So we were deeply honored by that.
That's great.
So, all right. Thanks very much for your time, and we'll hopefully see you all soon.